2600? That's too low. 6283, much better. Ladies, gentlemen, and Harajim of all ages, as you move along through to various stages of Diablo 4, you probably have one pretty major question on your mind. How do you get stronger? Well, of course, the largest decider of your power in general is your build, how well it synergizes, and a lot of a build has to do with your skill points. But what about everything else? How can you increase your power in Diablo 4 with absolutely minimal effort, even if your skill points are all put into the perfect places? Today I'm going to break down a number of ways to make yourself stronger that are relatively easy to do, apply to all characters and all builds. Quite a few of them you don't even need to leave the town to do, and the idea behind this is no matter what class you play, no matter what your playstyle is, you should come away from this with a better idea of how to make the game easier for yourself with a number of simple concepts to keep in mind. First up, before we dive into more specific actual methods that you can actively do, let's talk very plainly about how damage works in this game in a more broad way. There are tons of affixes that give you things like +% damage or +% crit damage, things like that. Those are what we call additive bonuses. They are all very good. You want to get a good collection of them. They make a big part of every build. But on a far more basic level, what you care about more than anything else are damage multipliers. There are 3 of these within the game outside of specific uniques and legendaries and specific class interactions, and they are critical hits, the vulnerable debuff that you can put on enemies, and overpower. Let's work with the default numbers on all of these stats, and let's say that you're doing a 100 damage hit. One hit for 100 damage. Critical hits by default deal 1.5 times damage, so that number jumps up to 150 already. If you also have a way to apply vulnerable to an enemy, that is a 1.2 times multiplier before any stats come into play, which would then raise the damage of that hit up to 180. If you have a method of getting guaranteed overpower hits, as some builds do, overpower by default is a times 1.5 multiplier, which would raise the damage of that singular hit to 270. On top of that, overpower also grants a flat damage increase to its procs based on your current health and fortified health as well, but we won't count that for the moment. 270 though is an insane amount of increase from the 100 that we started with. That's 2.7 times in multipliers just simply from taking advantage of these 3 mechanics. All of this to say, as important as stats are, as important as plus percentage things are, the biggest thing that you can do to make yourself deal more damage is simply bake into your build itself more ways to apply these multipliers more often. They are the biggest way to affect your damage, especially as every one of these stats can be increased by gear modifiers as well. So if your build does not have the ability to make things vulnerable, it probably needs to change. You probably need to find a way to do that. Or you need to use the exploit glyph in your Paragon tree, which also gives you a way to do it. If you can get yourself guaranteed overpowers as well, that's incredibly strong. Second up, quite simply, is item power breakpoints. We've known about this as a general concept for a bit, but this new handy graphic was recently put out from a user on Reddit whose username is in the corner, and this lays it out extremely nicely. At every one of these item power levels, a piece of gear will increase in power dramatically. Equipment gets better with every level of item power, but these are what we call breakpoints, where larger shifts will happen. Even if you manually upgrade a piece of gear to this point, for example, here's an amulet that I have near one of these breakpoints, upgrading an item adds 5 item power each time that you do it to a maximum of 5 upgrades. If we take this item power 711 amulet and upgrade it twice, it gets relatively minor upgrades. They're nice, but they're nothing massive. But look what would happen on the 3rd upgrade here, the one that would actually bring it past the breakpoint. The one to really look at here for stats is the % willpower bonus, which jumps up massively, but what you want to really pay attention to for the example is the gray numbers. These indicate the potential rolls for each affix. Notice how ultimate skill damage potential roll goes from 12 to 18%, all the way up to 18.2 to 27.3%. The old maximum roll is lower than the new minimum one. Spirit cost reduction goes from 8.3 to 14.2%, up to 12.2 to 20.9%, and my % willpower bonus goes from 2.5 to 6.1%, all the way up to 4 to 9.5%. Those are all massive changes in every single one of those affixes, and these specific breakpoints are a big way to increase your power if you're aware of them. Check your gear, especially if you haven't upgraded it. If anything that you are wearing is close to any of these breakpoints, you should upgrade it. If you get something that is just below these breakpoints but has good good affixes, you should upgrade it. The big secondary consideration here is when you hit a breakpoint, the item rerolls the exact numbers that you get. That's why my percent willpower bonus goes up an insane amount, but my ultimate skill damage only goes up by 2.1%. I had a really good roll in the previous bracket, but a relatively low roll in this new one. So basically, watch out for these breakpoints, push items to these breakpoints if they are close, but also always check the preview window before clicking upgrade on an item, because if you do it, there is actually a chance that an item could actually go slightly down in effectiveness if you get particularly unlucky. Third then, let's talk about weapons. There are a couple of important things to break down here, so I'll split this into two entries. First, let's talk about weapon primary affixes. When you look at a weapon, you will see all the stats that it has, of course, but you may have noticed a pattern. There is one specific affix for every weapon that is the same within a given type, the one above the gray line. Staffs get bonus damage to crowd-controlled enemies, maces get bonus over power damage, axes get bonus damage to healthy enemies, swords get bonus critical hit damage, all of those types of things. There's different ones for every kind of weapon. This is extremely important, as you may think the only thing that defines a weapon is good or not is the DPS number at the top and the affix at the bottom, but this actually makes a really big difference too. This way you can target specific weapon types for that guaranteed primary affix depending on your build for which primary affix makes sense for you. Rather than just looking for strong weapons as a general concept, you can actually focus this. It's also worth noting that primary affixes aren't a roll. They have a set value on a weapon dependent on its item power level, so there is no variance here between two axes of the exact same item power, for an example. The second thing to consider on weapons is attack speed. Every weapon has a damage per hit rating and an attack speed rating too. Putting those two things together works out the weapon DPS. That's the big number that you'll usually see on the weapon first. One-handed weapons swing faster but do less damage for each individual hit. Two-handed axes, for example, are considered a slow weapon, attacking less than once per second but having an extremely high damage per hit. The main reason that this matters is what the goals of your build are from the ground up. If you are someone looking to proc lucky hit chances, for example, you want to hit as frequently as you physically can. If you are trying to one-shot elites with a singular attack, you want a slow weapon that will do more damage in one hit, like the two-handed axe that I showed you. The one other thing to consider here too is even if you do want to attack faster, you may not specifically want to go to a one-handed weapon. Legendary aspects are twice as effective when put on two-handed weapons compared to their normal stats if used on other places. If your build wants more legendary aspects and a larger variety of them, then using two one-handed weapons, or a one-handed and an offhand, is perfect for that. But if you want one specific legendary aspect to be as strong as physically possible, then you want a two-handed weapon. Then you consider past that which type of one or two-handed weapon you want, with the primary axes we talked about before, and also the different ones having different attack speeds and different damage per hit. Our fifth point today then has to do with resistances to various elements and things like that. Things like lightning resistance or even poison resistance is a good example, specifically how it relates to gear. Here I have a helmet that says that it gives you 33% lightning resistance. This does not actually directly translate though. In fact, the way that it translates is actually quite bizarre. Here let's look at my stats without these armor pieces on. I have 42.5% lightning resistance. If I put on this helmet with 33% lightning resistance as an affix, I have 48.2% lightning resistance? That just makes no sense, right? It does not add 33% lightning resistance. It doesn't multiply my lightning resistance by 1.33. It just gives you a nice arbitrary chunk of lightning resistance. That said, this affix on gear is largely unimportant as a result of this. Just to show another example, my current poison resistance is 34.1%. I have a chest piece that says it gives you 31.5% poison resistance. If I put it on, the number of my stats goes to 42.2%. What decides this? I really don't know, but the jump is significantly larger than the lightning resistance, which had a higher number. It just seems somewhat arbitrary. The point being, these affixes aren't really worth it on your gear and become far less worth it the higher the number already is as well. It gets significantly diminishing returns, so adding these to all of your gear won't actually be all that good for you. So you have a piece of gear that otherwise has really good affixes, but one of them is elemental resistance of some kind, you should probably consider enchanting it to roll that away. With that said, let's move on to our next section, which is enchanting gear. This is a thing that means nothing to you in the early game. You really shouldn't do it and worry about it up to level 50, but is a big deal as you get into actually perfecting builds past level 50. If you go to the occultist in any major town, the last tab on their list of services is enchanting. This lets you literally just replace any individual affix on a piece of equipment. It will roll a replacement at random, which you can choose to accept or not, going back to the original roll. But you can only do this for one of the affix slots. Once you have chosen which slot you want to enchant, you cannot reroll a different one. That said, you can reroll the same slot multiple times, it just gets more expensive each time that you do it, to the point that enchanting this ring would cost me about 60k gold for the first time, but enchanting these gloves that I've been trying to make perfect would cost me 1.2 million. Yep, 1.2 million. All that to say, enchanting is useful. You should take advantage of it, but don't get lost in it on a singular piece. If the first couple of rolls that you make on an item aren't perfect, just cut your losses. Take the best affix that's offered to you, and accept that it won't be the perfect piece of gear that you were trying to make it. On top of that, an important thing to be aware of is that legendary items are more expensive to enchant, both as far as requiring extra crafting materials and extra gold, so if you're going to imprint an item with a legendary effect and you want to enchant it as well, always do the enchanting part first. Past that, you want to make sure that you are using gems and also that you're using them correctly. These drop like candy all throughout the game, and as you get to higher levels, you unlock higher grades of gem, with royal gems being the highest that you can currently acquire in Diablo 4. Helmets, chests, legs, jewelry, and weapons all have a chance of dropping with gem sockets already in them, and you can actually add sockets to any of these items as well at a jeweler in the towns, which you should do if you are trying to make your equipment that you already have even better. If you do this, you can have up to 5 gems in your different armor pieces, 3 of them in your jewelry, and 2 in your weapons, unless you're a barbarian, in which case you can get like 6 weapon gems because barbs are just silly like that. If you hover over each type of gem, it will tell you the 3 various effects that it can have based on what type of gear it is slotted into. Take a ruby, for example. In a weapon socket, this will give you bonus overpower damage. In an armor socket, this will give you a % maximum health increase. In a jewelry socket, this will give you fire resistance. And so it's important when creating your build and perfecting it to know which gems fit your build the best. Generally speaking though, I'd recommend always using skulls in your jewelry, as armor tends to just be better than straight up different elemental resistances, and in your armor pieces I would usually recommend rubies for the bonus max life percentage. But if your build makes particular use of barriers or fortify, there are other options for that too. In your weapon, this generally is more dependent on your build, as these actually offer differing effects, but generally the 2 strongest ones are sapphires, which gives you bonus critical damage to enemies that are crowd controlled, and that even includes slows for example, or emeralds, which give you bonus critical damage to vulnerable enemies. This one is technically better, as you can make bosses vulnerable much easier than you can give them crowd control, but that depends entirely on how good your build is at applying the vulnerable debuff, and both of these are dependent on your crit chance as well. Moving on then, let's talk briefly about Paragon boards. Of course there is some variance for every class on this, but there are some basics to consider. For example, when it comes to glyphs, I've harped on a few times about how important the vulnerable debuff is. If your build does not have a way to apply it, you absolutely should pick up the exploit glyph. This gives you a way that you can apply vulnerable regardless of your actual skills. On top of that, you may want this even if your build can apply vulnerable, as it also gives you bonus damage against vulnerable enemies. Another good example is the spirit glyph. This gives you bonus critical strike damage on your core skills, which a lot of the time is what builds are based around, that's why they're called core skills. But it also has an effect that gives you stacking bonus damage to a target the more times that you have critically hit it. So a build that attacks quickly and crits often absolutely needs the spirit glyph in their build. Aside from that, it's just the ability to look at the legendary nodes that are available to each class and then working out which ones fit the build that you are after, then finding the most efficient ways to reach the various wells of power on the board. Paragon as a system looks super threatening at first, but once you take a bit of time to understand it, it's actually pretty simple. And that's it as far as actual ways to increase your power in the town itself, but with that then let's talk about a couple of other things that the game doesn't tell you. Things that may not be obvious, but are actually pretty helpful if you want to gain power, specifically legendary power and unique power. Legendary and unique synergies are generally what make any good build into a great build, and sometimes they can create entirely new builds on their own. Having specific ones of these can completely change the way that you play the game, so here are a couple of tips for hunting them down. Hell Tides are a well-known source of legendary equipment, which is especially useful as you can open caches tailored to specific equipment slots if you are hunting down specific items. But if you just want the largest amount of legendaries possible within Hell Tide, you actually should focus on opening the mystery chests. There are at least 2 of these in various locations within each Hell Tide, and their spawns are somewhat randomized each time, but this is a map showing the potential spawns for each of these mystery chests. A normal Hell Tide chest will always drop 2 pieces of equipment guaranteed, with each of these having a decent chance of being a legendary. It's random. The mystery chest will drop 5 pieces of equipment with a significantly higher legendary drop rate as well. I have had mystery chests that drop 5 legendaries. They're nuts. The only caveat is, unlike the other chests, obviously they are random. You don't don't choose the slots, you just get a pile of legendaries. Then finally, let's talk about hunting down unique pieces. These are gear with powers that are arguably stronger even than legendaries. They can only drop in set specific slots and with set affixes on them too. And also you cannot extract or imprint aspects to or from a unique item. You have to find it as it drops and use it as it is. That said, hunting down specific uniques that you are looking for a build can be extremely tough. And while this is a little feely crafty, there is one activity that I have noticed more unique items dropping from during than any other, and that is Nightmare Dungeons. Last night I did 4 Nightmare Dungeons and 2 of those 4 dropped unique items. One of them I had been hunting down for nearly 20 levels of doing other activities while I sort of left Nightmare Dungeons on the side. I've since done more and more Nightmare Dungeons and had more and more unique drops, so while this isn't a data mine stat or anything like that, Nightmare Dungeons just drop unique items quite frequently, and my personal experience is that they drop them more often than any other activity that I've done. And that's it for today then, everyone. A good 10 ways to help you increase your power in Diablo 4 extremely quickly. Many of these are just things that you can do in town. Minor changes in your skill point spending, different ways to look at Paragon boards, and ways to make each individual piece of gear that you are making notably stronger. Things to consider for your entire journey for the rest of Diablo 4. Then of course the couple of tips at the end for just hunting down legendaries and uniques. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope it helps you in your journey to become unstoppably powerful within this game. Like if you liked the video, subscribe with the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet. Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.